let's talk about test case development. Given the requirements we have, we need to come up with some description of what a test case looks like. Now, there's test scenarios, there's test cases, there's different terms, and there's some nuance that sometimes is put out there. I don't necessarily care within that. I mean, a test case, a test scenario, from my standpoint, are good enough to be synonymous. There's not a whole idea of it, but the basics of this is a test case is a set of directions that you're going to execute on a system to see if it does what it's expected to do. So when I execute a test, the test case should tell me exactly what I'm looking for and how I should evaluate whether it was successful or not. And it needs to be fairly specific in this, because your interpretation of what a successful test is might vary based off of your level of expertise. What looks great to an amateur is probably, oh my gosh, that was totally failed to an expert. And some experts might be overly critical. They might be asking the system to do more than what's actually required to get done. So test cases can be informal. Not every single one of them has to be super formal, document, everything else like that. I can provide a general framework. I've seen scenarios before where, as particularly in user acceptance testing, where we kind of define some products and some customers, some members, and we give some basic playground for which the user acceptance testers can go in and see if everything's working fine. I kind of just make up as I go, see what's important to them, see if it looks acceptable. This is not the typical case, because I normally want to be able to document that, oh yes, the system is working and this is exactly what it's doing and this is the exact requirements that were tested and how they passed and whatnot. But because this becomes very hard to repeat, it is acceptable from the standpoint of sometimes I'm just trying to give a specific stakeholder a view of the system and to see if they're okay with it. So most of the time we want formality in our test cases. Most of the time we want a known approach and a common way of doing testing throughout the system. I want to be able to repeat my test cases with extremely clear results that should be the same every single time it executes. Even better, if I can automate my test cases, that will get me exactly what I need and what I'm going for in my final solution. So all of this starts with a test scenario. If I had this type of person and they had this type of need for the system, they did these types of actions, what would the result be? The whole idea of a test case is to come up with what you think is the proper way the system should behave given a specific set of circumstances. And unfortunately, I would say it's become very common for these to be documented in generalities. We just kind of talk about, well, is the login test case working? Well, there's not just a single login. There's all sorts of logins right inside of there. And so when we think of it in terms of scenarios, we can start to envision, instead of oh, by the way, Carolina, hello, welcome in. We can start to think of scenarios instead of as being just some abstract test case. We can actually personify them into a specific scenario around specific actors. So for instance, I worked for a project in the Department of Food, Drug, and Dairy. And within that project, we tested farms and whether farms had, we took samples from farms, sample from the milk, sample from the soil, and tested it for bacteria and whatnot. And so we had the Purple Cow Dairy Farm. That was one of the samples that went inside of there. And we had a specific inspector. I don't remember what we called the inspector at that point. But the inspector would go out to Purple Cow Dairy Farm, and there'd be other dairy farms that were out there as well. But specifically, Purple Cow would be testing specific types of things. It would be like, okay, Purple Cow was, let's just say, our happy test scenario where everything passed and it turned out great. The sad bovine place maybe had all the failures. And so the idea is it's really trying to get to the specifics of what the system should be doing and should look like. So to imagine the scenarios and traditional requirements, I have to, as a tester, really put together the system. I have to go through each bullet point, each numbered item, and kind of make what the system looks like. It's fine, it works, but I have to have a strong traceability matrix, and I have to have a full picture of the requirements to know that I'm really covering everything in a given scenario. Use cases, we've done a lot of the work of imagining scenarios up front. We've described what the screens would look like and what the user interactions and what the flow will look like. We don't need to look at the design at that point because the use case generally tells us what we expect to see. So that's why I push use cases so hard, is because not only do I feel that they're a better way of documenting requirements, they certainly, I think I can make the argument, provide a quicker path to creating test cases and test scenarios. All right, so when we talk about this test scenario, it's a pretty simple thing. It has the steps that the user is going to take to work with the system, the data the user knows about when doing that, the inputs that they're going to give to the system, and most importantly, the expected responses. Not just, hey, the user goes to the system and they're going to log in and they'll be successful. Okay, well, what does successful login mean? Do they go to the home page? Do they go to a blank page? Do they go to the profile screen? We want to be specific inside of that. And if they go to the profile screen, what should I see on that profile screen? I mean, if there's messages that pop up, some websites will have, hey, here's an alert message. What messages should be there for that test scenario? Because sometimes something subtle like that could be an indication of other problems, if not in the system, but maybe in the test case that could come up later on. We want to be able to control and predict the environment in which things happen to be able to understand and predict the code and how it's behaving. So let's go into an example of what a test case might be. It's not ridiculously complicated. We're talking about pages and pages of stuff, but here's a sample scenario. So a user in step 1 provides to the screen there a new item that they're going to be adding into this screen that manages items. And so we can see specific data items. We're going to have the name, it's a Boba Fett action figure, and the description, it's Star Wars toys, and here's the price, and then we have today's date. Doesn't have to be a specific number there. We know what today is. And particularly on dates, they become tough to work with because, if I put a hard-coded date in, it might screw up the system. And then the user presses the add and finish button. And then I have very clearly right there for that step, what's my expected response? So I'm not 5 or 6 or 7 steps later on evaluating what should have happened. I should see right now the system shows the data item is added and takes us to the collection screen. So that's a very specific thing. It's a very specific response that I'm expecting from there. And then the next step is I'm going to validate the data above as shown on the screen. So it's a test step. It's not necessarily an action step, but I'm seeing on the next screen, did the fields I just added above get saved inside of there? If not, there's a couple things I could look at. The system might be bugged. I might have typed in something, fat fingered something, done something wrong. And so I can go off and check it. But since I have it documented right here, I can go off and double check it. Character for character, number for number. I can go off and re-execute the test case then, copy and paste them if I have to get it out there, but I can really see if my test was successful and if so, what made it successful inside of there. So largely of what we're talking about in this test scenario is black box. We're focusing on the requirements, what the system should be doing, and we're looking at each requirement and each of the business rules. I'm not expecting you in this class to get into the how, but there's nothing about a test case that needs to avoid that per se. A test case needs to be focused on its goal, intent, and life cycle. And so its goal and intent could be just a validated requirement. It could be just to make sure certain aspects of the system work. And it could be, the life cycle is important because I can make a test case that I only care about for this project because I want to make sure I never see this bug again on this project. But I have to be aware that the more specific my test cases are, particularly in validating the results, the more fragile they become moving forward. So yes, I am indicating I want to put things on screens and validate things on screens, but to say the screen layout has to look exactly like this means that if that requirement changes or if there's a reason to change how the screen is laid out, it could really impact the test cases where if I do change the layout of a screen, I may have to go through and retweak a whole lot of test cases in order for them to pass going forward. So there's nothing here that's exclusive to black box or white box. I just want to let you know that from the testing approach, I have looked at this from a black box, and that is a perfectly valid way of doing it, and I can mix it up there a little bit as well.